The moment Pope Leo XIV's voice shattered the sacred silence of St. Peter's Basilica with a thunderous alto, Alessandro Marchetti's world collapsed, because the most powerful man in the Catholic Church had just recognized something that could destroy everything he'd built with the woman he loved. The word echoed through the ancient dome like a gunshot, freezing 200 guests mid-breath. Isabella Romano, radiant in her grandmother's silk gown, turned from her groom to stare at the figure emerging from the shadows near the altar's edge. Her bouquet of white roses trembled in her hands as she tried to process what was happening. The celebrant priest, Father Benedetti, stood with his mouth half open, the sacred vows dying on his lips. Alessandro felt his legs weaken beneath him. The papal ring caught the morning light streaming through the stained glass as Pope Leo XIV stepped forward, his weathered face grave with recognition. The pontiff's recent illness had left him gaunt, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made Alessandro's blood turn to ice. "Your Holiness," Father Benedetti stammered, bowing quickly, We were not expecting—" Silencio. The Pope's voice was quieter now, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. His gaze never left Alessandro's face, studying him with the precision of a man who had spent decades reading the souls of the faithful. "There is something here that requires clarification." Isabella's confusion was palpable as she looked between her groom and the Pope. "Alessandro." Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the cathedral's perfect acoustics, everyone heard the uncertainty creeping into her tone. Alessandro swallowed hard, tasting copper. His collar felt like a noose as sweat beaded along his hairline. The congregation behind them had fallen into that particular kind of silence that only comes when something sacred is being violated. He could feel 200 pairs of eyes boring into his back, waiting for an explanation he couldn't give. Pope Leo XIV took another step closer, his papal robes rustling against the marble floor. "Before these vows are spoken," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the basilica, "before this union is blessed by God, there must be truth." His eyes narrowed as he studied Alessandro's face with the intensity of a man who had just solved a puzzle that had been troubling him for years. Complete truth about who stands before this altar. Pope Leo XIV's hand found the marble altar rail for support, his knuckles white against the stone. The tremor that had plagued him since his recent collapse in the Vatican gardens returned with vengeance, starting in his fingers and spreading up his arm like electricity. He tried to steady himself, but the recognition hitting him was more overwhelming than any physical ailment. Alessandro watched in horror as the pontiff's face drained of color. The congregation shifted uneasily, sensing something beyond a simple interruption. Isabella reached instinctively toward her groom, but Alessandro stepped back, his movement sharp and telling. The Pope's mind raced back 3 weeks to his private study, where Cardinal Toretti had spread photographs across his mahogany desk. "The art theft investigation has stalled, Your Holiness," the Cardinal had explained, pointing to a grainy security image. "This man disappeared after the Vatican Museum incident. Marco Benedetto. He used his position as a restoration expert to access the archives. At the time, Pope Leo XIV had studied the photograph with detached interest, filing the angular features and distinctive cleft chin away in his memory. Now, staring at the groom before him, those same features stared back with desperate clarity. "Your Holiness, are you well?" Father Benedetti stepped forward, genuine concern replacing his earlier confusion. The Pope's breathing had become labored, his usually commanding presence wavering like a candle in wind. "I am—" Pope Leo XIV paused, his voice catching. He looked again at Alessandro, no, at Marco, and saw the recognition reflected in the young man's terrified eyes. The groom knew that he knew. "I am perfectly well, Father." But he wasn't. the weight of what he was seeing pressed against his chest like a stone. This wasn't just about a stolen artifact or a false identity. This was about a woman who was about to pledge her life to a lie, about vows that would be built on deception from their very first words. Isabella's confusion deepened as she watched the strange exchange between her groom and the Pope. "Alessandro, what's happening? You look like you've seen a ghost." The irony of her words wasn't lost on Alessandro. In a way, she had. Marco Benedetto was supposed to be dead to the world, buried beneath the identity he'd stolen from his twin brother. But Pope Leo XIV's penetrating stare was pulling him back from the grave, exposing him like sunlight burning through fog. "Perhaps," the Pope said slowly, his voice regaining its strength, "we should speak of ghosts." Alessandro's right hand moved to his left wrist in a gesture so automatic he didn't realize he was doing it, the same nervous habit that had gotten Marco Benedetto caught on Vatican security cameras 3 months ago. His thumb traced the thin scar hidden beneath his shirt cuff, a childhood reminder from when he and his twin brother had crashed their bicycles trying to race down the steep hills of their Sicilian village. Pope Leo XIV's eyes followed the movement with laser precision. In the cardinal's grainy photographs, this exact gesture had been circled in red ink. "He always touches his wrist when he's nervous," the investigator had noted. "Classic tell. We've seen it in 4 different security feeds." Isabella noticed her groom's strange behavior and placed her hand gently on his arm. "You're shaking," she whispered, her voice filled with loving concern. "It's just nerves, amore. Everyone gets nervous at their wedding." But Alessandro's trembling had nothing to do with wedding jitters. Sweat gathered at his temples despite the cool morning air flowing through the basilica's open doors. He tried to stop his hand from moving, but the habit was too deeply ingrained. Under stress, Marco Benedetto always touched that scar, and Pope Leo XIV was watching every movement like a hawk studying prey. "Perhaps the groom needs a moment to compose himself," suggested Isabella's father, Signor Romano, stepping forward protectively. He was a practical man who had built his construction empire by reading people, and something about this entire situation felt wrong to him. Alessandro forced himself to smile, the expression sitting awkwardly on his pale features. No, I'm fine, just overwhelmed by the honor of His Holiness's presence." He looked directly at Pope Leo XIV as he spoke, hoping to project confidence, but his hand betrayed him again, fingers finding that telltale scar. The Pope's slight nod was almost imperceptible, but Alessandro caught it. Recognition, confirmation. The game was up, even if no one else in the cathedral understood what was happening yet. Isabella's maid of honor, her sister Sophia, leaned close to whisper, "He looks like he's about to faint. Maybe we should get him some water." "I'm perfectly fine," Alessandro said too quickly, his voice higher than usual. But his eyes remained locked on Pope Leo XIV's face, searching for any sign of mercy, any possibility that this nightmare might end differently than he feared. The Pope stepped closer, his papal ring catching the light as he raised his hand slightly. "Are you certain about that, Alessandro?" The way he said the name, with just enough emphasis to make it a question, sent ice through Alessandro's veins. The silence in St. Peter's Basilica became a living thing, pressing against the walls and settling into the bones of every witness. Pope Leo XIV's gaze held Alessandro with the intensity of a man who had spent decades hearing confessions, reading souls, and detecting the subtle tells of guilt. The pontiff's dark eyes, weakened by illness but sharpened by wisdom, seemed to pierce through every carefully constructed lie Alessandro had built around himself. Alessandro's own eyes darted everywhere except toward the Pope. He studied the intricate marble patterns at his feet, the golden altar cross behind Father Benedetti, the nervous faces of Isabella's bridesmaids. anywhere but those penetrating papal eyes that seemed to see straight through his borrowed identity to the criminal underneath. The congregation sensed the psychological battle unfolding before them. Whispers rippled through the pews like wind. Through wheat, Isabella's grandmother clutched her rosary beads, her weathered fingers moving in silent prayer. The wedding photographer, confused by the unexpected drama, lowered his camera, unsure whether to capture this moment or respect its gravity. "Look at me, my son." Pope Leo XIV's voice carried the gentle authority of a confessor, but underneath lay steel. It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in pastoral care. Alessandro's head turned as if pulled by invisible strings. When their eyes finally met, the truth passed between them like an electric current. The Pope's slight nod confirmed what Alessandro had feared. This wasn't about suspicion anymore. This was about certainty. Isabella felt the tension radiating from her groom like heat from a forge. "Alessandro," she whispered, her voice tight with growing alarm. "What's wrong? You look terrified." But Alessandro couldn't speak. Under Pope Leo XIV's unwavering stare, his throat had closed completely. The man who had smooth-talked his way into Isabella's heart, who had charmed her family with stories of his architectural work, who had convinced everyone he was Alessandro Marchetti, that man was dissolving under the weight of papal authority. The Pope's eyes never left Alessandro's face as he spoke to the congregation. "Sometimes, my beloved children, God places us in moments where truth must be spoken, regardless of the consequences." His voice carried to every corner of the cathedral, where the foundations of what we believe must be examined. Alessandro's legs felt like water. He gripped the altar rail to keep from swaying, but even that small movement seemed to confirm something in the Pope's mind. "And sometimes," Pope Leo XIV continued, his gaze boring into Alessandro's soul, "we must ask ourselves, who are we really blessing today?" Pope Leo XIV stepped forward, his papal robes rustling against the marble like whispered prayers. The morning light streaming through the stained glass windows seemed to converge on him, casting him in an almost ethereal glow as he faced the trembling groom. When he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his office, not loud but absolute. "Tell me, young man," the Pope said, each word measured and deliberate, "what is your true name?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and inescapable. Alessandro's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, his face draining of all color. Isabella turned sharply toward him, her bouquet forgotten as white roses scattered across the altar steps. "What kind of question is that?" Isabella's father demanded, stepping protectively toward his daughter. "His name is Alessandro Marchetti." What is the meaning of this interruption? But Pope Leo XIV's eyes never left Alessandro's face. "Is it?" he asked quietly. "Is that truly who stands before us today?" The congregation erupted in confused murmurs. Isabella's mother clutched her pearls, while the groom's side of the cathedral, notably sparse compared to the bride's extended Italian family, shifted uncomfortably. Alessandro had always explained his small wedding party as the result of being an only child with few living relatives. "Your Holiness," Father Benedetti interjected nervously, "perhaps there's been some mistake." "There has indeed been a mistake, Father," Pope Leo XIV replied, his gaze still locked on Alessandro, "but not the kind you imagine." He took another step closer, close enough that only Alessandro could hear his next words. "The question is whether it will be corrected now, before God and these witnesses, or whether we continue this charade." Alessandro's legs gave out slightly, and he gripped the altar rail with both hands. Isabella reached for him instinctively, but he flinched away from her touch, a movement that cut through her heart like a blade. "Alessandro, what is he talking about?" Isabella's voice cracked with the first note of real fear. "Tell me what's happening. Tell me he's wrong." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Alessandro looked at the woman he loved, truly loved, despite everything, and saw his entire world balancing on the edge of destruction. Her dark eyes, so trusting just moments before, now searched his face for reassurance he couldn't give. Pope Leo XIV raised his voice so the entire congregation could hear. "I ask you one final time, in the presence of God and these witnesses, what is your name?" Alessandro's lips trembled as he whispered, I am Alessandro Marchetti," he said, but the words came out strangled, desperate, even as he spoke them. Alessandro knew they sounded like a lie. His voice cracked on his own supposed name, betraying him before 200 witnesses. Pope Leo XIV's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted, disappointment mixed with pity. "Are you?" he asked gently. "Because the man I'm looking at bears a striking resemblance to someone else entirely, someone who has caused great pain to the church." Isabella stepped between them, her wedding dress rustling with agitation. "Stop this!" she cried, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I don't know what game you're playing, but Alessandro is not who you think he is." The words escaped Alessandro's lips before he could stop them. The admission hung in the air like a death sentence, and he immediately wished he could pull them back. But it was too late. The first crack in his carefully constructed facade had become a chasm. Isabella's face went white. "What did you just say?" Alessandro's hands shook as he reached for her, but she stepped back instinctively. "Isabella, please let me explain." "Explain what?" Her voice rose to near hysteria. "Explain how you're not who you claim to be. Explain how I'm standing at an altar about to marry a stranger." The congregation had gone silent again, but this time it was the silence of people witnessing a catastrophe. Alessandro could feel their collective gaze boring into him, could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Everything he had built over the past 2 years, every carefully crafted story, every moment of genuine love with Isabella, was crumbling around him. "I wanted to tell you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "God, Isabella, I wanted to tell you so many times, but I was terrified you'd leave. I couldn't lose you." Pope Leo XIV watched this exchange with the patience of a confessor who had heard every possible variation of human weakness. When Alessandro looked at him with pleading eyes, the pontiff's expression remained implacable. "The truth has a way of emerging," Pope Leo XIV said quietly. "It always does. The question is whether you will embrace it willingly or whether it will be dragged from you piece by piece." Alessandro's shoulders sagged in defeat. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Isabella said before the Pope could respond. Her voice was steel wrapped in silk. "I want to know everything." Alessandro's voice broke as the words tumbled out like stones from a crumbling wall. "My name is Marco Benedetto. Alessandro Marchetti was my twin brother." He looked at Isabella's stricken face and felt his heart shatter. "He died 3 years ago in a motorcycle accident in Sicily." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella's bouquet slipped from her numb fingers, white roses scattering across the marble like fallen snow. She stared at the man she thought she knew, searching his familiar features for some sign that this was all a terrible mistake. "We were identical," Marco continued, his voice hollow. "Same face, same build, same scar from when we crashed our e-bikes as children." His hand moved unconsciously to his wrist again, that nervous tell that had exposed him. "After the accident, I found his documents, his university records, his clean slate. Alessandro had been accepted to architecture school in Rome. He had a future planned out, everything I'd never had." Pope Leo XIV watched with the solemn gravity of a judge weighing souls. The morning light streaming through the stained glass seemed to dim as Marco's confession unfolded. I was nothing, Marco whispered. A small-time criminal from a forgotten village. Alessandro was going to be somebody. So I became him. I took his identity, his dreams, his chance at a better life. His eyes found Isabella's, desperate for any flicker of understanding. I thought I could honor his memory by living the life he never got to have. Isabella's legs gave way, and she sank onto the altar steps, her white dress pooling around her like spilled milk. 3 years, she breathed. We've been together for 3 years, and you're telling me you're not even real? My love for you is real, Marco said desperately, dropping to his knees beside her. Everything between us, every moment, every kiss, every promise, that was all real. I may have borrowed his name, but my heart has always been my own. But who are you? Isabella's voice was barely a whisper. If you're not Alessandro, then who did I fall in love with? Who am I supposed to marry? Pope Leo XIV's voice cut through the anguish like a blade. That, my child, is an excellent question. Because the man calling himself Marco Benedetto has his own secrets to confess. Marco's blood turned to ice. The Pope knew more than just about the stolen identity. He knew about everything. Pope Leo XIV's voice carried the weight of divine judgment as he spoke to the frozen congregation. Marco Benedetto is wanted by Vatican security in connection with the theft of priceless artifacts from our sacred archives. The words fell like hammer blows in the hushed cathedral, including a 15th-century illuminated manuscript worth over €2 million. Isabella's gasp echoed off the vaulted ceiling. She scrambled backward on the altar steps, her wedding dress trailing behind her, as she put distance between herself and the man she no longer recognized. A thief? The word came out strangled, disbelieving. You're a criminal? Marco's face crumpled as his final secret was laid bare before God and witnesses. Isabella, please. He used forged credentials to gain access to our restoration department. Pope Leo XIV continued relentlessly. For 6 months, he systematically photographed and catalogued our most valuable pieces. The theft occurred during a carefully orchestrated power outage that disabled our security systems. The congregation erupted in shocked murmurs. Isabella's father stepped protectively in front of his family, his face dark with rage. You brought a criminal into our family, into our home. You let him near my daughter. Marco remained on his knees, broken. I never meant for it to go so far. I was desperate, drowning in debt. But when I met Isabella, his voice caught. When I fell in love with her, I tried to stop. I wanted to walk away from everything, but they wouldn't let me. They? Pope Leo XIV's eyebrows rose slightly. The people I owed money to. They said one job would clear my debts. Marco's hands shook as he spoke. I thought I could steal a few small pieces, sell them quietly and disappear. I never imagined I'd find something worth living for. Isabella's sobs filled the cathedral. Everything about you is a lie. Your name, your past, your work, even how we met was probably planned. No. Marco reached toward her desperately. Meeting you was an accident. The coffee shop near the university, I was only there to scout the area. But when you smiled at me, when you laughed at my terrible jokes about Roman architecture. His voice broke. That was the first real moment I'd had in years. Pope Leo XIV's expression remained stern, but not without compassion. Love built on deception cannot stand, my son. Truth demands its due. Marco looked up at the pontiff with hollow eyes. What happens now? Now, Pope Leo XIV said quietly, we discover if redemption is possible. Isabella sat motionless on the altar steps, her grandmother's silk wedding dress now stained with tears and scattered rose petals. The woman who had awakened that morning as a radiant bride was disappearing before everyone's eyes, replaced by someone hollow and lost. Her dark eyes stared at Marco as if seeing a stranger, which she realized with crushing clarity she was. 3 years, she whispered, her voice echoing in the cathedral's vast silence. 3 years of lies, every kiss, every I love you, every promise you made, all of it built on deception. Her hands trembled as she removed her engagement ring, the diamond catching the morning light one last time. Before she set it on the marble beside her, Marco reached toward her desperately. "Isabella, my love for you was never a lie. Don't!" The word exploded from her lips like a gunshot. "Don't call me that. Don't you dare use words of love when everything about you is false." She struggled to her feet, her wedding dress hampering her movements. "I don't even know what to call you anymore. Alessandro, Marco, or is that another lie too?" The congregation watched in stunned silence as Isabella's family moved to surround her protectively. Her mother, tears streaming down her cheeks, wrapped a shawl around her daughter's shoulders. Her father's face was stone, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "How could I have been so blind?" Isabella continued, her voice rising with each word. "The way you never talked about your childhood, how you had no old friends, no family photos. I thought you were just private, maybe hurt by loss. I never imagined you were living someone else's life." Sophia, her sister and maid of honor, stepped forward. "We trusted you," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "We welcomed you into our family. Isabella defended you when Papa worried about how quickly you'd appeared in her life." Marco's face crumpled. "I wanted to tell her so many times, I almost—" "But you didn't," Isabella cut him off. "For 3 years you looked me in the eyes and lied. You let me plan our future together, knowing it was all built on sand." She turned to face him fully, and the pain in her eyes was devastating. "Did you ever love me, or was I just part of your cover story?" The question hung between them like a blade. Marco opened his mouth to answer, but Isabella held up her hand. "I don't think I can believe anything you say anymore." Pope Leo XIV watched this destruction of love with sorrowful eyes, understanding that sometimes truth's mercy required first. Breaking everything false, Marco slowly rose from his knees, his movements heavy with defeat and newfound resolve. When he spoke, his voice carried a gravity that hadn't been there before, the weight of a man who had finally stopped running from himself. "You're right, Isabella. You're right about everything." He looked directly at her, no longer the desperate, encornered criminal, but someone who had found something worth more than his freedom. "I've spent 3 years living a lie, and I can't ask you to build a life on that foundation." Pope Leo XIV watched with the keen attention of a shepherd, recognizing the first stirrings of genuine repentance. The pontiff remained silent, letting Marco find his own path to truth. "Before I came here today," Marco continued, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face, "I contacted Cardinal Toretti. I told him everything, about the theft, about the forged identity, about where the stolen manuscript is, hidden." The congregation stirred at this revelation, but Marco's eyes never left Isabella's face. "I'm turning myself in after this is finished." Isabella's breath caught. "You're confessing?" "I've already confessed. The authorities are waiting outside." Marco's smile was heartbreaking in its sadness. "I couldn't marry you while carrying these secrets. You deserve so much better than a life built on lies." Isabella's father stepped forward, his anger tempered by confusion. "Then why? Why come here at all? Why put my daughter through this humiliation?" Marco's voice broke slightly. "Because I had to give her the choice. I couldn't disappear without letting her know the truth about who I really am." He turned back to Isabella, his love for her written across every line of his face. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I've destroyed everything good between us, but I needed you to understand that my love for you, the only real thing in my life, changed me." Pope Leo XIV stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "What do you intend to do now, my son?" "I'll serve whatever sentence they give me." Marco said without hesitation. "And when I'm released, I want to dedicate my life to restoring what I've damaged, the church's treasures, the trust I've broken." He looked at the Pope with something approaching peace. "I want to earn the right to be the man Isabella believed I was." Isabella stood frozen, her heart warring between the devastation of betrayal and something else, something that recognized the genuine transformation she was witnessing. "Is redemption possible for someone like me?" Marco asked quietly. Pope Leo XIV's answer would determine everything. Isabella stood at the crossroads of her heart, feeling the weight of 200 pairs of eyes watching her make the most important decision of her life. The silence in St. Peter's Basilica was profound, broken only by the distant sound of Roman traffic beyond the ancient walls. Everything she had believed about love, trust, and forgiveness was being tested in this sacred space. She looked at Marco, truly, looked at him, seeing past the borrowed name and stolen identity to something deeper. In his eyes, she found the same man who had stayed up all night when she had food poisoning, who remembered how she took her coffee, who cried during the ending of old movies. The man who had taught her to see beauty in broken Roman statues, saying they were more interesting for their imperfections. "You're a thief and a liar," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the cathedral's perfect acoustics. Marco flinched as if struck, but didn't look away. "You stole artifacts from the church. You stole your brother's identity. You stole 3 years of my life built on deception." Her family moved closer, expecting her to walk away, to end this nightmare and begin healing. But Isabella raised her hand, stopping them. "But you didn't steal my love," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "That I gave freely, and I gave it to the man I saw in your actions, not your words, the man who volunteers at the children's hospital, who brings flowers to my grandmother every Sunday, who defended a homeless man when others mocked him." Pope Leo XIV watched with the intense focus of someone witnessing a miracle of human grace. This was why he had intervened, not just to expose truth, but to create space for redemption to bloom. Isabella stepped closer to Marco, close enough to see the hope and terror warring in his eyes. "I can't marry Alessandro Marchetti today," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "because Alessandro Marchetti doesn't exist." Marco's face crumpled, prepared for the final blow. "But someday," Isabella continued, placing her hand gently over his heart, "when you've served your time, when you've made your amends, when you've learned to live as the man you really are." She paused, her own tears flowing freely now. "Someday, if you still want me, I might be willing to marry Marco Benedetto." The gasp from the congregation was audible. Marco stared at her in disbelief. "You would wait for me?" Isabella's smile was radiant through her tears. "Love waits." Pope Leo XV stepped forward, his weathered hands raised in benediction as the golden morning light transformed the cathedral into something ethereal. The silence that had been heavy with shock and betrayal now carried a different weight, the profound quiet of souls witnessing divine mercy in action. "What we have seen today," the pontiff announced, his voice resonating through every arch and alcove of St. Peter's Basilica, "is not the destruction of love, but its purification. Not the end of a story, but its true beginning." His eyes moved. Between Marco and Isabella, both kneeling before him with tears streaming down their faces. "Truth is painful, but it is also liberating, and love that survives truth becomes unbreakable." The cathedral doors opened with solemn ceremony as Cardinal Toretti entered, followed by 2 Vatican security officers in dark suits. Their footsteps echoed against the marble as they approached the altar, but their manner was respectful, almost reverent. The congregation watched in hushed awe as this unprecedented scene unfolded before them. A wedding transformed into a moment of profound spiritual reckoning. Marco rose slowly, his hand slipping from Isabella's grasp one final time. The weight of 3 years of deception lifted from his shoulders like chains falling away, replaced by something he had never truly known before. Peace. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what awaited him. He had traded his wedding suit for honesty, his freedom for redemption, his false identity for the chance at genuine love. Isabella stood as well, her wedding dress now a symbol not of celebration but of transformation. The silk that had been chosen for joy now represented something deeper, the courage to love beyond betrayal. "Wait," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the cathedral. She walked to where her engagement ring lay forgotten on the marble steps, picked it up, and pressed it into Marco's palm. "Keep this safe for me, for when you're ready to ask again, as yourself this time." Marco's fingers closed around the ring, holding it like a sacred promise. The diamond that had once symbolized a lie now represented the possibility of truth. "I will earn the right to give this back to you." Her father stepped forward, his anger replaced by reluctant respect. "Take care of my daughter's heart," he said gruffly. "It's the most precious thing she owns." Cardinal Toretti approached with surprising gentleness. "Marco Benedetto, you are under arrest for theft of Vatican property and identity fraud. But His Holiness has requested that you be treated with the dignity befitting someone who has chosen the path of repentance." As the security officers flanked Marco, Pope Leo XIV raised his hand one final time. "Before you go, my son, receive this blessing." He placed his hands on Marco's head, speaking words that seemed to flow directly from heaven. "May your imprisonment become your liberation. May your penance become your peace. And may your return to the light be swift and complete." The procession that left the cathedral was unlike any wedding party in history. Marco walked with quiet dignity between his escorts, while Isabella followed at a distance, surrounded by her confused but supportive family. The congregation filed out in stunned silence, each person carrying the weight of what they had witnessed. A love story that had been broken apart only to be rebuilt on an unshakable foundation. 3 years passed, like seasons of growth and healing. Marco served his sentence with exemplary behavior, spending his time in prison, studying theology and art restoration. He wrote letters to Isabella every week, each one signed with his real name, each one more honest than anything he had ever written as Alessandro Marchetti. Isabella waited, not passively, but actively choosing love over bitterness, hope over despair. She volunteered at the same children's hospital where Marco had once served, keeping alive the good parts of the man she loved. When Marco was finally released, he found Isabella waiting outside the prison gates, older and wiser, but with the same radiant smile that had captured his heart in a Roman coffee shop years before. They returned to the Vatican together, to the same pope who had shattered their false beginning to make room for their true one. In the Vatican gardens, surrounded by ancient olive trees and the soft scent of Roman roses, Pope Leo XIV performed their wedding ceremony. This time there were no secrets, no stolen identities, no hidden agendas, only 2 souls who had been tested by fire and emerged refined like gold. The guest list was small but meaningful. Isabella's family, who had learned to forgive. Cardinal Toretti, who had become Marco's spiritual mentor, and several fellow former prisoners whom Marco had helped find their own paths to redemption. "Marco Benedetto," the Pope said as the afternoon sun painted everything in golden light, "do you take Isabella Romano to be your wife, in truth and in love, for all the days of your life?" "I do," Marco replied, and this time The words carried the full weight of an honest heart. When they kissed as husband and wife, the bells of St. Peter's rang out across Rome, celebrating not just a marriage, but the triumph of truth over deception, of love over fear, of redemption over despair.